lecturing and research, and I'm particularly looking at fluid dynamics, which is how gases and fluids and liquids flow.
Cool. Quan probably fell asleep as you were describing the last part, but it's great to hear, man. And Ricky, how'd you come to know Jesus, mate? And tell us about your work as well.
Yeah, cool. So I grew up in a Christian house, so I was a Christian my whole life. But specifically, I think when I went to university, went through that traditional transition phase, right? So asking questions like, do I actually believe what my parents told me my entire life? So probably similar to Ed, like 18 or 19 was when I really became a Christian, because I sort of weighed the evidence for myself and came to those conclusions myself. My area of work is I'm in human movement or sports psychology, so I lecture in those areas at Federation Uni, so specifically looking at this idea of dynamic systems, so self-organization of movement and how that applies to sport. Yeah.
And you guys are both actual doctors, unlike the medical doctors in the room who are pretend doctors.
Controversial, but
yeah.
It was our title first, but
yeah.
we won't go there.
That's right. My wife's one of those pretend doctors, and we'll talk about this later, I'm sure. So you guys both work you're Christians, you both work as in research and applying science in your work. I'll start with you, Ricky. For you, why would you say science doesn't disprove Christianity?
Yeah, so when I was sort of looking at this question before today, I think the first thing that I picked out was that particular question, like does God exist, and then applying a scientific reasoning to that is based on scientific materialism, right? So the physical world is all that exists, and it exists in our mind but also outside of us. So it's kind of centered on that idea. And for me, and this is going to sound strange coming from someone in research, but that actually highlights the limitations of science. So there's this assumption, right, from that perspective or worldview that everything in the world can be measured through scientific reasoning, which is completely untrue. So putting the God question aside, science has provided, I would say, not great explanations for other phenomena in the world that exist, that we know and accept that exist. You know, like moral judgment, love, death, those sorts of things. They don't really it doesn't provide a coherent explanation of those things. And so for me, science is limited to answering the questions in which that worldview has been set up to answer. There's principles that we accept as researchers. A hypothesis should be falsifiable. You ask the question, does God exist? That is an unfalsifiable hypothesis. Similar to saying, does love exist? We all in here would accept that love exists, probably, right? Maybe not. Some people were like, we're just bags of cells. If you're Richard Dawkins, fine, you can go that way. But yeah, science answers many wonderful questions, but there's some that it cannot within that particular worldview.
So there's a limitation to the focus and scope that scientific method can be applied. Ed, what about your own thoughts on this? So why do you think science doesn't disprove Christianity?
I think because often I have big personal questions about life and who I am. Things like, why do I feel guilty sometimes? Is there a spiritual world out there? What happens when I die? And those big questions are really personal, and science just doesn't seem to have the tools to answer them, but I find satisfying answers in Jesus.
It's helpful. So with that, how do you then have science and your knowledge of Jesus go together? Like, do they actually work together? Is that a thing? Or do you have to turn off your Christianity when you go to work and you turn it back on once you leave the office?
I think they go together. So, if I think of physical laws, something like gravity or about how electricity works, it's eternal, it's true at all times, It's universal, it's true everywhere, and it's above and beyond us in the sense that we can't control these things. They're just always true, whatever we do. And yet, despite the fact it's sort of out there, out of our control, it also plays an intimate role in our everyday lives and how we live. And that points me to a God who has those characteristics, who is eternal, universal, above and beyond us, and yet plays an intimate role in our lives. And I find it hard to believe that physical laws of that nature have come from nothingness.
So when you're at work and you're pressing into and using and studying these laws, how does your knowledge of God interact with that? Like, what does that mean for your work?
I think kind of working with mathematical equations and how they relate to physical laws, seeing those two areas kind of collide and coalesce and be true at the same time, points me to like the wonder and awe of God that's made this world that kind of has those two things that shouldn't sit together and yet do so nicely.
So like, turns out that maths actually describes reality, and reality can be measured in maths, and you're sitting there going, wow, God's awesome, that this actually is the case. Okay, yeah, cool. And Ricky, tell us for yourself, how does it go together, your knowledge and faith in God and your work as a scientist?
Yeah, so just off the back of what I was sort of saying before, there are many questions that science can answer. Science is actually a huge gift from God. And yeah, I think for me, there's certain things that God has said in the Bible that scientific reasoning can help us to understand. Like we heard it, I just thought of this when I was sitting there listening to the reading, in the beginning. That's actually a very dumbed down scientific explanation of the existence of time and matter coming into the world. And you guys would have probably heard this before. And yeah, there's actually no naturalistic explanation that evolutionists can give for the existence of time and matter coming into the world. They might say matter existed forever, but they would have to concede then that the world would not be as it is right now, because we'd be in a low energy state. It wouldn't exist as we know it. So kind of going back to what I was saying before, there's a principle of it's called Occam's razor. It's the simplest explanation is usually the best explanation, and that's what we apply across all our research. And I actually think that the burden of proof sits heavily on people who, evolutionists and that, to prove us wrong, which they've tried to do. But for me, science interacts well in that way, actually providing us with that explanation. And in my own work, for example, I observe and see people, take a baby, for example, learning to crawl, walk, which is relevant to me now. My son's 16 months. There is something inherently built into us to be able to do those things. We self-organize our movements. We develop this ability to walk, run, do wonderful things with our bodies. And science helps us to understand that, but also it points me to God to say that someone or something has to have built that into us. It just, it can't just be there from nothing and everyone collectively sighs. And, it's an old argument, but I think it holds true. And that's, they're not, science and Christianity are not opposites to each other. Maybe at certain points they diverge, but they do definitely come together in many ways.
Yeah, thanks. And if you want to ask questions, you can ask questions of these two guys as well. So my number's up on the screen. You've still got a chance to shoot them through. And Quan, why don't you come back up and join us? We'll have a chance to grill these guys now. Cindy would have loved to be here as well. Cindy's the one person at church who is like the classic scientist that you think of when you think of a scientist. She sits in a lab all day, staring through a microscope and running experiment after experiment, and she actually enjoys it. Quan, we'll start with you, so give you a chance to think of questions you might want to ask these two guys. Just a clarification question first that came in. As you're talking about evolution and God, are you saying that evolution is unsatisfactory and didn't happen, or that it's an incomplete theory? So, sorry, are you saying that it didn't happen, or are you saying that it's an unsatisfactory theory on its own, or incomplete?
I think both. So it is unsatisfactory and it is incomplete if that's all that there is in terms of answering the origin of the universe.
Mm.
Yeah.
So that's an evolution without God.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. There's a few questions that came in related to that. And another question came in. So how compatible do you think Christianity is then with scientific theories like the Big Bang, multiverse theory, and evolution? Guys, come across this way as well. We're all standing in the corner. Yeah.
Yeah, the multiverse part I have heard and read a bit about, but it's a theory on its own, and one of the argument was that there is kind of like a generator that pumps out these universes, and over time there happens to be one like the Earth that is habitable for life. Again, I would still find that quite unsatisfying to claim as the case. What was the other one, sorry?
Big Bang, multiverse theory, and evolution. Yeah. How compatible is Christianity with these theories?
Yeah. Now I'm going to answer as a bit of a theologian and not scientist. So I'm just going to say simply that no matter what theory of the origin of the universe is, it still does not take away that there is a creator God who caused all things to happen. And that is a Christian worldview. So even if things like evolutionary process, even if things like, I haven't read too much about the Big Bang to know the full account, so maybe these guys can help me. But even if that were to be the case, it still begs the question that there is a God, and the Christian worldview still holds that there is a God who created it and caused it to happen.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll just add one thing quickly, because it reminds me of a talk that I went to, would it be a few years ago now, from I can't remember his name. He's a prominent theoretical physicist. Get that? Yeah. So yeah, theoretical physicist, and he presented tentatively this argument that we can actually read there's some evidence now suggesting you can read the waves of what is supposedly the Big Bang now, like they're still rippling off now. And he suggested, interestingly, going back to that Genesis verse, in the beginning, like Big Bang theory is interesting because it suggests a start point, right? Depending on how you interpret it. But he suggested, actually, from a Christian point of view, the Big Bang theory is not necessarily in opposition, because it provides that start point, and depending on what side of the camp you sit on, you'd say it came from nothing. But that's not really a satisfactory theoretical explanation if you apply that to what the Bible suggests, that time and matter existed in you just kind of see where I'm going. So, yeah, depending on, maybe I'm tentative to believe fully in that, but that's one way of potentially seeing it, yeah.
There's another question that just came in. Again, I think pressing a little bit more, there's a lot of interest in the room about evolution, Christianity. Can these things go together? Some of these questions are coming in sort of positively pressing into it. Some are coming in considering are there issues with that. Maybe we'll go, Ed, did you want to speak to this at all? Do you have any thoughts before I go to Quan?
I think they can sit together in the sense that I think in the Genesis narrative, the order in which things happen is the order in which you'd expect kind of evolution to have happened. And so I think that ordering is not in conflict.
And Quan, do you think, are there theological issues that we might have just supposing evolution on its own, or a Christian theory of evolution that we need to think through?
I think it would be problematic to say that evolution was not the way that God could have used to cause the world to happen.
Sorry, there's so many negatives. You lost me. Say it again.
To say that the evolutionary process is not one of the ways that God could have caused the world to happen, I think that's problematic.
Why is that problematic?
Because as far as Genesis is concerned, it answers the question of who rather than how. I really think that. And especially in the context of the Bible and in Genesis, in its context as well, in the Mesopotamian context that it was written towards and in, it was answering that very question. So, who was it that made the whole world? When the Israelites, God's people, nations surrounding them had different views. So, to them, it was the one God who made all things.
There's a few more questions I'd love to get to, but we are out of time. Would you thank these guys and come and find them at the end of church? Take a seat. Now, today might have sort of opened up questions for you or things you want to think about further or discuss further. Don't just let this now wash over you and walk out. Stick around. We're going to have lunch together after church, and it's a chance to sit down with people over a meal and go, well, what do you think? What are the issues? Where do you think we came from? What do you think human life means? Where are we going? These are really, really important things, aren't they? Because they affect our lives, our sense of where we fit in the world, and how we would relate to God. The God who we've heard this morning really is there and really did make us.